Today by Nisrin Elamin, who will be doing a short interview with us to provide insight into the crisis in Sudan. Nisrin Elamin is a scholar and activist, an assistant professor in the Departments of Anthropology and African Studies at the University of Toronto, and a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective. Her research investigates the connections between land, race, belonging, and empire making in the Sudan and the broader Sahel region. Before pursuing a PhD, she spent over a decade working as an educator, researcher, and organizer in the United States and taught for several years in Tanzania. Welcome, Nisrin. To begin, can you provide some background into the crisis that erupted in Sudan in April of 2023 and a bit of history into how the 2019 revolution and the preceding events leading up to it factored into the crisis?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So usually when I provide a background for what is happening for the war that started on April 15th, 2023, I like to go back in history. I really should be going back to the kind of 19th century, but in the interest of time, I'll start kind of at independence. And so, you know, Sudan's December Revolution is often compared to its 1964 revolution that was sparked by clashes between students and police at the University of Khartoum that toppled Aboud's military regime, or to the 1985 revolution triggered by price hikes that toppled Jafar Nimeri's regime. In both cases, the military sided with the people, if you will. But I really think we should trace its genealogy back to the 1950s. Britain's parting gift to Sudan at independence in 1956 was an economy dependent on the extraction of cash crops like cotton and on the exploitation of farmers, and a political system which was constructed to serve the interests of a riverain central and northern Sudanese elite at the expense of the south and other peripheral regions, or marginalized regions, I should say, but also of a rural population that sustained this extractive, export-oriented economy. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state unsurprisingly came from tenant farmers who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as world cotton prices plummeted in the 1950s. A strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosti shortly after independence. And this is a fairly, not a very well-known historical event, but I think it's important. The state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking tenant farmers were shot on the fields or suffocated in detention cells. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between South Sudanese demanding political representation and regional autonomy, and the central government, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony. And this 1956 massacre is linked to the civil war because striking farmers were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against Southern rebels. And I highlight this moment in particular because it reveals the way state violence in Sudan that is racialized and gendered has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that serves elite interests by any means necessary. So we can draw a straight line from the outbreak of the civil war in Sudan, which over the decades and over two phases killed over 2.5 million mostly southern Sudanese people, to the current war that arrived in the capital Khartoum on April 15th. In 2023. In the same way, I think that we can draw a straight line between the Nakba of 1948 to the genocidal violence the Israeli state is currently unleashing in Gaza. And I think history here is not only context, but it's the necessary framework of analysis to understand the roots of state violence in and beyond Sudan. And so since the 1970s, and certainly under the al-Bashir regime, we saw this need to serve Sudanese elite interests by any means necessary manifest itself in the form of an ethno-nationalist, racist, right-wing religious project being imposed on a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious country in violent ways. We saw this play itself out in Darfur, where a state-sanctioned campaign of genocidal violence led by the Janjaweed, now known as the Rapid Support Forces, was carried out beginning in 2003, killing hundreds of thousands, wiping out entire villages of Black African-identified people and displacing millions of Sudanese civilians. And while this campaign went through various phases, this violence never really ended, as is evident from the massacres that took place during this war in West Darfur. And I just want to mention too, I think there were kind of US organizations that formed around this moment in Darfur in the early 2000s, that raised awareness about Darfur, but really excised Darfur from the kind of broader political economy of Sudan. And I think contributed to a kind of obfuscation of like, you know, that violence was not tied to other forms of violence in other marginalized regions. And as a result, I think we still failed to understand the roots of the violence, right? And so in April of 2019, a powerful revolution ousted dictator Omar al-Bashir. And that was triggered by a kind of cost of living crisis, but also by a convergence of grievances around decades, right, of repression, of violent repression, land dispossession in these kind of more marginalized regions, calls for sort of, economic justice, grievances against political repression from the 90s onwards, in the capital as well, or in the center, and so forth. And so it converged actually symbolically in a massive sit-in in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum. And this, at some point, the sit-in, I think, numbered almost 1 million people. And the sit-in remained in place for 3 months after al-Bashir's ouster, because its demands exceeded calls for regime change, and because military elites from within al-Bashir's inner circle had kind of reclaimed power. And the backbone of this revolution consists of neighborhood resistance committees, of which there are close to 8,000 across the country, but also independent farmer and labor unions, professional associations, youth, feminists, student formations, the kind of grassroots civil society that has mostly resisted NGOization and kind of formal opposition party politics. And, you know, these resistance committees, they're kind of neighborhood consensus-based committees. They've been operating in the absence of a state since like the mid 2000s, like 2011, 2013. Their revolutionary charters are crafted by their entire membership. They have coordinating committees at various city, district, state levels to which they elect representatives. Most emerged during anti-government protests in 2013, triggered by IMF recommended austerity measures, but we can also trace their genealogy back further. Beyond coordinating protests, they've also organized around access to water and against government land grabs. And their politics kind of differ across class and region, and they've had to contend with internal contradictions and fragmentations, but in my view, they really represent one of the most powerful kind of revolutionary movements in the world. And so in June of 2019, we saw the RSF orchestrate a massacre that broke up the sit-in. And we saw after that massacre, the resistance committees and the more radical elements of the revolution sidelined during the formation of a transitional government in August of 2019 in favor of civilian elites, many from the diaspora, who attempted to open Sudan up after decades of isolation due to Clinton-era sanctions to international donor funding. And those civilian elites kind of turned outward during the transition, adopting neoliberal reforms rather than remaining inwardly focused on the demands that were emerging from the streets. So an example of that is the Abrams Accords, a normalization with Israel agreement, which was signed by Sudan during this transition, following states like Bahrain, the UAE, and Morocco in exchange for being dropped from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism, and the promise of a $1.2 billion loan from the World Bank amidst opposition from the streets. And then after the October 2021 military coup, we saw the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the UK lead peace talks that legitimized and propped up military leaders like Burhan and Hemeti, who I'll talk about in a minute, who are both responsible for war crimes that span decades, framing them as potential reformists rather than heeding the call of the resistance committees, which called for no negotiations, no legitimacy, and no partnership with the military. And so when the long war came to Khartoum in April of 2023, the military coup regime imploded and basically split in two. I mean, the trigger was kind of security sector reforms that were supposed to subsume the RSF into the army, and there was kind of contention over how long that process would take. But really, the war kind of, once this military coup regime there were already tensions between the rapid support forces and the army. But in April, basically, they started fighting each other, vying for economic and political control of the state. On one hand, we have the rapid support forces, formerly known as the Janjaweed, led by General Hemeti and its allied militias, whose leaders control much of the livestock trade and much of the illicit gold trade in the country, which gets funneled through the gold markets of the UAE and sold to Russia and other countries. And on the other hand, we have the Sudanese armed forces and its allied militias, allied Islamists, led by General Burhan, who control much of Sudan's economy. Close to 200 companies in rubber, livestock, wheat, cement, real estate, and construction, which are in turn backed by Gulf financing and have close ties to Egypt's Sisi. And recent reports suggest that Iran has also been kind of drawn into this war on the army side. Yeah, and the RSF, or the Janjaweed, was created by al-Bashir as part of a coup-proofing strategy. They were also legitimized, the RSF, by something called the Khartoum process in 2014, a process through which the European Union is attempting to externalize its border to the region between Libya and Sudan. At the time, the RSF under al-Bashir was funded to the tune of $200 million to militarize that border in order to stem migration of East Africans into Europe. The RSF and the army have also sent troops to fight in Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf, thereby kind of expanding their transnational networks. And the last point I'll make is that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, since the kind of early 2000s, have invested over $27 billion in Sudanese land, real estate, and infrastructure. And they now control more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's large domestic investors combined. And what that has meant is that they mostly are growing, like most of the land that they've bought up is being used for animal feed, like alfalfa and rhodus, and gets exported to the Gulf for like their dairy production. So it's not really about food security. It's about, I mean, I think it's about empire making, but you know, it's not even about food security in the narrow sense. And really what that's done is it's undermined people's, you know, small farmers have gone into debt, they've been dispossessed. So you know, we went from basically having been the kind of breadbasket of the region to being turned into a food insecure kind of region area because of this restructuring of the kind of agricultural sector. And we have to, yeah, and so I think we have to understand both the fact, you know, the kind of man-made famine that is happening right now, and the way these like kind of sham peace talks in Jeddah, as part of the political economy of this war, as part of the way that external actors are trying to preserve their interests, protect their interests, and that you know that our people are unable to really kind of sustain themselves in the same way that they could have maybe a decade ago, you know.
Can you give some insight into how international forces, such as the humanitarian aid and border regimes, as well as the global capitalist order and the imperialist aspirations of neighboring countries, have also impacted and contributed to this crisis? What can we do here in Canada to show our solidarity towards Sudan?
No, that's an excellent question. I don't know if I have the time to like fully unpack it, but let me start with the international aid community. I mean, you know, both the RSF and the army, depending on, you know, which borders they're controlling, are obstructing aid from getting in. The little aid that is getting in is getting weaponized in certain ways or bought up and resold, you know, things like that. And so very little of the aid that, you know, I mean, for one, the UN announced that about $4 billion are needed to launch a robust relief effort. And only, I think, 26% of that has actually been pledged by the international community. So there is a lack of kind of will on the international community's behalf to actually launch this, you know, support a robust relief effort. In addition to that, in addition to aid not getting in, aid workers being obstructed, those who are actually operating are also operating under dangerous conditions, so they're not being protected. What we have seen over the last months is that more of these international aid agencies are now funneling their money to the emergency response rooms and the local responders for a variety of reasons, which is a good development. At the same time, it puts, you know, these young people at higher risk. I mean, these are not people, you know, they should be studying, they should be getting in trouble for, I don't know, skipping school, you know, or something like that, instead of, you know, running a humanitarian aid response. And there's also been, I think, a hesitance on the international aid community's kind of behalf to really funnel money to organizations like the ERRs that are not registered. Like a lot of them require some form of registration. There's this kind of bureaucracy and red tape that is preventing more resources from getting into the country that really people need to let go of because people are dying, you know? And you
Mm,
know, my view is always what we need actually is for a bit of a hands-off approach on Sudan in terms of like it's turning into there are more and more international actors getting involved. The international actors in many ways got us in this mess in the first place. I mean, at least
mhm,
we have to put blame where blame is due, which is the RSF and the army. But at the same time, you know, the U.S. even during this transitional period was playing a really negative role in propping up these you know military elites in exploring you know investment opportunities at a time when they should have really been supporting calls from the streets to kind of
mhm,
bring these war criminals to justice. You know, so that's I think another aspect of it. Canada. I mean, one of the things we did not talk about is the violent border regimes that are
mhm,
preventing Sudanese people from entering, you know, from seeking refuge, right? From
mhm.
claiming asylum.
Yeah.
Whether that's in Egypt, where the border has basically closed, the people are having to spend, I think, 1,600 per person to get smuggled
Wow.
in, and even then, they often get imprisoned or deported, right? And before the war, it was quite, you know, nobody needed a visa except if you were under 50, a male under 50. Um, you know, and it's not that much better at other borders. Certainly, you know, in Canada, there is a humanitarian pathways that was opened recently for members of like people who have relatives in Canada, and the cap was set at 3,250, and that's
Mhm.
minimum. I mean, that's just ridiculous,
Yeah.
really. You
Yeah.
know, given the sort of given that it is the largest internal displacement crisis in the world, even larger than Ukraine, you know,
Mm,
it's kind of mind-boggling that you wouldn't use the model of Ukraine, which was to not put any caps, and
mhm,
they're saying that you know people have to pay to get the, you know like and the bureaucracy involved in it is quite complicated. So it
mhm.
basically prevents a lot of people from even taking advantage of it. And the same for Gaza. I mean, it's I think Gaza it's even less. It's like 1,000.
1,000. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, so I think here we see another form of kind of, yeah, a violent border policy that is, yeah, denying people the right to claim asylum. There are Canadian mining interests. There's a PR firm in Montreal. I can't remember its name right now, Madsen and something, that represented the RSF for various periods of time. So, you know, I mean, we I think as Sudanese, and this is I'm including myself, have to do more research to really kind of trace the political economy of this war right back to
Mm,
Canada. And I think we also have to think about the ways in which our pension funds, our universities'
yeah.
endowments are invested in the military industrial complex and in the mining companies that are kind of exploiting whether it's you know war in Sudan or war in the Congo, and to kind of start making those linkages, right? The same
Mm,
companies that are benefiting from the genocide in Gaza are also probably benefiting from what is happening in the Congo and in Sudan. And once we start making those connections, I think we can sort of ground our solidarity. I mean, I think that's
mhm.
one thing. I also think that a lot more deep study is needed, right?
Yeah.
Like when people say Palestine, Sudan, Congo, my sense is that people still know very little about what's happening in Sudan. And the
Mm,
average Canadian is walking around thinking this is an entirely internal war that has nothing to do with me, that I'm not complicit in. And that is
mm,
absolutely wrong, right? We are
mhm,
always, I mean, in the global north, we are complicit in every single war in this world. That's for
mhm.
one. But particularly in the context of Sudan, the UAE is one of the biggest players, and our economies are entangled with the UAE's. And I think there are ways in which we could be putting a lot more pressure on the UAE, even though it's an authoritarian regime. But people are, you know, whether it's through Netflix or they go travel there or they buy, you know, uh, halal frozen foods from the UAE. These are all
Yeah.
things that I think we should reconsider, you know, and put, I think they will probably respond best to negative PR that is coming from non-Sudanese, right?
Mm,
I think
mhm.
that's probably the only thing that they would really respond to. Um, and so, yeah, I think we need to start making those linkages. You know, the same Arab countries that are normalizing relations with Israel are causing harm in Sudan.